Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on building healthy soil. My name is Deborah, and I'm a volunteer at the Minnesota State Horticultural Society. Today's presenter is Maks Kopish. If you are not a member of MSHS, now is a good time to join. Members receive not only our award-winning magazine, but also discounts at nurseries and greenhouses, free tickets to our local home show, free webinars, and more. Your membership dollars also allow us to bring great programming like this to all of you. Please welcome this evening's guest. Maks Kopish is a mushroom cultivator, avid compost maker, and vegetable gardener. They live on a 10-acre homestead near Viroqua, Wisconsin, where they are partnering with soil microbes to develop perennial food forests. Take it away, Maks.
Thank you. Yeah, well, as I just gave away, a lot of the perennial food forest has been eaten by bunnies, but it's an ongoing development here at Potter Ridge Farm. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming and hanging out tonight. My very long-winded title for this talk is Shepherding Soil Microbial Livestock for Resilience and Peace. I was tempted to add in the garden at the end, but I think that a lot of the things I want to talk about kind of apply to a lot of elements of life, so I just left it at that. So just to introduce myself a bit, oops, went too far. This is a picture of our farm. We have an old tobacco barn here, 10 acres, and I live here with my wife. We have a couple of goats, some chickens, and 2 kittens that live inside. And yeah, we're working on a lot of garden development to kind of, the farm before we moved here was all in pasture for many, many years. So the soil is in decent condition, but the sod is very thick. And so starting gardens without tillage, as I'll kind of talk about, has been a major challenge, but also it's our 3rd summer now, and we're starting to see a lot of the fruits of our labor. So very exciting. So I wanted to start out, just, I know it's always the doom and gloom you don't want to talk about, but if we're talking about soil and agriculture, we got to just face it. So I wanted to start out by saying this: restoring soil health is as much about fixing our relationship with and understanding of the soil as it is about fixing our relationship with and understanding of ourselves. I think I've really come to see that a lot of the ways that we look at agriculture and horticulture, farming, gardening, anything that is our connection to the soil and the earth has definitely gotten kind of out of whack, as I think a lot of you would probably agree. We use a lot of violence in our methods, you know, whether it be tillage or pesticides, herbicides, things that are targeted at killing things in nature. And a lot of our actions have created huge catastrophes that we're now kind of coming to face, whether it be in the 1930s in the Dust Bowl or modern day Dust Bowls that are occurring because we just kind of keep doing the same things over and over again. Like Einstein says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, which I think is what we see a lot of in agriculture, specifically through the kind of white colonial lens that a lot of the globe is now kind of adopted. And so my perspective kind of in the years that I've been studying soil health and meeting with farmers and gardeners and people who are really passionate about agriculture is that we really know a lot about how to change, but we're kind of stuck in a paradigm that seems to be very fear-based. It seems to me that we're constantly trying to control nature because we're so afraid of nature controlling us. And what that relationship or lack of relationship does is just create this fear-based response. So we keep going on the path that we're on. Bad things happen, and then instead of kind of taking responsibility for our actions and the role that we have to play in some of this damage on earth, we could just start to see ourselves as victims rather than taking responsibility and trying to shift our perspective. And so I'm hoping to kind of tonight offer a different perspective and encourage all of us as we walk away from this presentation to kind of start having these conversations about what a paradigm shift in agriculture and our relationship with nature and the soil and the earth could really look like. To start off, I wanted to have a little analogy that I just recently have been thinking about. So on the right side of the screen is a picture of a beautiful moss and various lichen communities on some bark that I found. And I recently was listening to a podcast where a lichenologist was talking about the fungal partners in a lichen community, because lichen they look like one organism, but they're really symbiotic, complex ecosystems that contain many organisms, fungi, algae, bacteria. And so this lichenologist was talking about the fungi as if they were imprisoners of the algae, or captors. And they were saying how the fungi, capture the algae and they exploit them for their photosynthetic capabilities. And that just kind of boggled my mind, because that's not how we really think about lichen generally. We think about them as being like these pillars of symbiosis, all these organisms working together. And I was thinking, what if the fungi thought of themselves like humans now think of ourselves? What if the fungi really did think of itself that way, as this like exploitive entity that was trying to imprison algae so that it could get all of its photosynthetic sugars? The algae, I think the fungi, if it did have that mindset, would become the same as us. It would have the scarcity mindset where it thinks, oh, there's not enough algae to go around, I have to capture every last one, which feeds into greed and, trying to capture everything and take away what's not really needed to be theirs. So I don't think that's the fungal outlook. And I kind of want to challenge humanity, I think, to have to look at ourselves more like the fungi probably actually do see themselves, which is as just one of a very complex, dynamic, living partnership, part of a dynamic symbiosis that really benefits all of the parties involved. So the fungi are getting photosynthetic sugars from algae and bacteria, but they're also sharing a lot with those partners as well. They're giving them shelter. Fungi in lichen communities actually provide like a greenhouse effect for algae and bacteria, so that they don't dry out or get baked by the sun. So they're giving them shelter, they're giving them stability to live in climates where they otherwise couldn't, like on rock faces or bark. They're also giving them minerals that they digest off of the rocks and wood. So it's very symbiotic. And I think that if we humans can start to think of ourselves more like fungi, creatures that are part of a web of life and that are able to offer just as much as we take, we might be able to shift more into this regenerative agriculture paradigm and start to really heal our relationship with the soil in a very organic, natural, relationship-based way. So hopefully that analogy wasn't too long-winded, but at least you got to see some pretty pictures. So how do we shift the agricultural perspective then? I think step one is this combined process of unlearning a lot, relearning some things, and then learning individually a lot of different material. So we're going to kind of take these step by step. As far as soil science goes, the unlearning that we have to do is this, I'm just going to call it a white colonial Western patriarchal approach to looking at soil, which is that it is a dead, inert material, or a medium that we can basically impose our will upon. So we've really kind of, in the last couple of decades, or maybe the last couple hundred years, started to make that the way we look at the soil. It's just something that we pour chemicals into. It holds the plants we want to grow. It doesn't really do anything besides serving as this base for the plants. It's made, for so many years, soil science in universities was seen as such a boring subject because it's this old, dead, crusty, dry science. And we've equated soil and dirt as just being lifeless, dead matter. Now there's this renaissance happening where people are starting to understand that the soil is teeming with life. It's this dynamic, beautiful, amazing community of organisms. It is attracting so many new minds and thinkers, and soil science classes at universities are selling, or not selling out, I guess it is for profit, but you know what I mean? It's hard to get into some of those classes because everybody is excited about the new way that we can look at soil. So we have to unlearn that old paradigm of the soil just being something we kind of impose our will upon, like I said. We also have to unlearn quite a few other things, including, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to move the webinar thing here so I can read these words. But our scarcity economics. So we really have kind of come to think about nature as being something where food is scarce and that we have to be in competition for it. But it's really not the case. Earth is an abundant place. There's plenty of food to go around. It's all kind of our model of doing things in agriculture that makes food scarce. You know, there's plenty of food to go around, but because we insist on certain economic paradigms and certain efficiency models, it doesn't get to where it needs to go, which is in the hands of and bellies of people. So there's a lot of things to unlearn here. Isolation, like I said, and sterility protocols is kind of a weird thing to think about, but just as a small example of this, thinking about sterile potting mixes in the horticultural world. That is something where people, for a long time, it makes sense. Like you want your plant to go into something where it doesn't have to face disease-causing organisms. But we're really starting to understand now that that blank canvas, just like for me in mushroom growing, a sterile substrate is completely prone to colonization by disease-causing organisms. It makes your job a lot harder as a gardener or as a mushroom cultivator or a farmer if you're starting with a sterile substrate or a sterile medium. We want systems that are rich with life and diversity, and that for the past few decades is what we've been killing off as humans. So we need to unlearn that sterility mindset. And then the last one, the human superiority complex, our need to control nature, which again, I think is really fear-based. And that leads into our separateness and our feeling that we don't belong in nature, that we aren't part of it, that we're above it or outside of it or something else, you know. All these things are kind of contributing to the problems that we see in soil, in agriculture, and just in the climate, in the world at large. And so relearning is kind of goes hand in hand with this because this, like I said, is a paradigm that is very new and has been only part of humanity, I think, for a couple hundred years in our million-year species lifespan. Thousands and thousands of indigenous peoples and communities across the globe have known a lot of the things that Western science is now proving for ages. Polyculture, plants live better in communities where they can help each other out and help fight pests, disease together. That the soil is alive, that trees can communicate with each other and with plants and with fungi. All the principles of regenerative agriculture that we're kind of going to talk about in soil building are part of indigenous agriculture and have been for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Even quantum physics, I put this in there because it's a small hobby of mine to try to understand what's happening in that realm. But one of leading quantum physicists are starting to understand that the nature of the universe is based on relationships among subatomic particles. And we, you know, even if you don't know the specifics, that is something that indigenous cultures have been trying to teach us white Westerners forever, that the world is based on relationships and relationships really matter. And so this, again, how can we relearn these things? How can we elevate those ways of knowing? And also appreciate that Western science is starting to show them in very unique and interesting ways. And so now on to individual learning of maybe new concepts, new ways of looking at things. This slide or this list here is kind of the outline for the rest of the presentation. So I kind of want to talk about the basics of soil as an ecosystem, not a medium, how photosynthesis and plants support soil life, how soil life in turn supports photosynthesis and plants. We want to talk about how soil is really the stomach of the plants and how microbial relationships, like with mycorrhizal fungi, enhance digestion for the plants and kind of make those analogies to the human gut microbiome. And then I want to talk about what healthy soil actually is, because I think it's kind of a complex definition. It's kind of like the definition of a weed. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. So we'll talk about ecological succession, soil communities, and then a little bit of practical application. So 7 billion, I just like to throw this number up there because it's gigantic. It's the number of humans on the planet, and it's also the low-end estimate for the number of microorganisms in just one tiny teaspoon of healthy soil. So why would soil be such a rich, busy metropolitan area? I think that really it's because soil is one of the first biomes of life on Earth besides the sea. When creatures started to move from the oceans of ancient Earth onto land, it was the semi-aquatic soil ecosystem that they first found themselves in. It's thought that fungi were the original plant root systems, and that relationship, so that relationship is completely ancient and beyond. Humans weren't even a concept in Earth's imagination when plants and fungi and all of these tiny little microscopic creatures that we're kind of going to talk about, whether they be bacteria or protozoa, nematodes, all of these little microbial beauties that formed relationships with plant roots way before humans ever even thought about existing, let alone farming or trying to grow our own plants. That web, that whole relationship that has co-evolved over eons and eons is now kind of simply being referred to as the soil food web. And just like all food webs on Earth, except for maybe the deep ocean, the bacteria that can chemosynthesize and use methane to create their own food. All other webs on Earth start with the sun. So we all kind of know about photosynthesis, which I'll kind of dive into in a little bit. But the sun is providing so much to Earth, and the plants are the start of the soil food web. They're providing food when they die in decomposition as composters and gardeners. We all know that. But then also something that we're really going to talk about here is the importance of plants while they're still alive and how they provide food to this underground web of life, and how this is really a shared mutual relationship. And then I just included here humans because that's kind of the paradigm shift that I'm talking about. We are part of the soil food web, and I think we need to move away from seeing ourselves as just people that damage it or that have the capacity to cause harm, into seeing ourselves as shepherds, as people that can care for the soil and can understand how it works. Through that understanding, we can offer it things that it needs. We can be like the fungi in the lichen community, where we're not only getting things from it, we're not getting our crops, our apples and corn and our lettuces. We're actually providing the soil food web with what it needs to thrive. I'm hoping that paradigm kind of makes our relationship with the soil a lot healthier. It makes the soil a lot healthier because we're now providing it with things that it needs rather than destroying it at every turn. And I think it helps us find a lot of peace and happiness and just kind of more meaning in our life as humans, because we can understand that we are part of something greater. So since I mentioned the sun and how important it is, I always like to just do a little review of photosynthesis, because I think this is something that we should really think about every single day. Not just as horticulturalists, agriculturalists, gardeners, farmers, whatever, but just as human beings, because it's why we exist. We all know from basic school, school science, that plants take in carbon dioxide from the air, they use water from the soil, and then they use the sun's energy, like actual light rays, to break apart the carbon dioxide and give us oxygen to breathe. That's what I kind of took away from my high school studying of biology and photosynthesis, is just like, yeah, okay, oxygen, good, we need that. The critical piece of it, though, is that what their plants are doing is creating sugar. They're taking carbon dioxide, which is just a gas in the atmosphere, and they're making food out of it. And just how fundamentally kind of jaw-dropping that is, to think that they're making sugars and carbohydrates and proteins, the foundation of all biological life on Earth. They're just doing that with sunlight is amazing. And so we know that the sugar that's produced through photosynthesis is used to build plants. Like, it makes their whole structure, their flowers, their stems, their roots, everything that makes a plant can be made through photosynthesis, and the sugar that it creates. But critically, when a plant is photosynthesizing, it's not actually using all of the sugar that it produces. It actually leaks out a lot of the sugar into the soil ecosystem. And I don't know if you're all up on food science and how sugars and carbohydrates and proteins are made. But the very, very bare bones of it is that a sugar molecule is what you see here, just a short little molecule. If you start combining those sugar molecules, you end up with carbohydrates, and the more sugars you add on, the more complex the carbohydrates become. If you add nitrogen onto the carbohydrate, you get proteins, and so on. So all of those things, sugars, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, really what the plants are cooking up in their little plant kitchens are cakes and cookies. And so here you have a plant that is now leaking out this delicious smorgasbord of sweets into the soil. And why would they do that? Why would they not just use that to build a thicker stem or make more flowers to attract more pollinators? Well, it's because of what we talked about. They have co-evolved with organisms like fungi and bacteria, protozoa, nematodes, to feed them. They've evolved over all of these eons to attract the bacteria and the fungi to their root zone with the sharing of these cakes and cookies. And through that, the plant is benefiting. In the case of fungi, the plant is actually getting a partner who enters into its root cells. Like, how did that happen all those eons ago, where the plant, as an autonomous organism, allowed a fungus to actually enter into its cells? It could have been a struggle at first, but then they realized that there was something they could share with each other. The fungi are getting the photosynthetic sugars from the sun, and the plant is getting mineral nutrients and water from the fungi. In the case of bacteria, all these bacteria are in the root zone of the plant eating all of these exudates, the cakes and cookies. That's the scientific word for them, is exudates. The bacteria are there, they're eating up all these things, and they're locking all of these nutrients inside their bodies. And bacteria are complete organisms. They're the complete package of nutrition. So they have tons of nitrogen and phosphorus and micronutrients, all the things in their little cell walls. So the plants don't actually get anything directly from them, unless it's the case of rhizobia bacteria that are fixing nitrogen. But in general, the bacteria are just this massive horde. And in order for the plant to actually get anything out of them, it needs to attract larger organisms, protozoa and nematodes, microarthropods, predatory nematodes, all of these other creatures that are going to come and, like little vacuum cleaners, they're going to suck up all of the bacteria, and then they're going to do what all biological life does, poop. And that poop is going to be pure nutrients in plant available form every second of every day, right in the root zone, ready for the plant to soak it up. So in this amazing co-evolution, the plant has figured out how to attract life that can give it everything it needs to thrive. And all of the organisms have found their place, their little biome where they're able to get what they can't get from the soil, the carbon from the atmosphere, the sunlight energy, liquid sunshine, carbon, they get that from the plant. So it's this amazing symbiosis here. And here, don't try to read this slide, but it's all of the nutrients, macro and micro, that a plant needs to thrive. The things highlighted in yellow are all of the things that these micronutrients and macronutrients do to support photosynthesis. And so why would all of these things, I guess what I'm trying to say here is all of these things are the things that a plant can't get from the sun alone. And it needs all of those microbial partners in the soil to provide them. And when you think about it, it's in the soil microorganism's best interest to provide the plant with what it needs to be most efficient at photosynthesis as it can be. They want the plants to be the best at making cakes and cookies, the best bakers in town. So it's in the microorganism's best interest to provide these micronutrients every second of every day. As soon as the plant needs it, they need to be there ready to offer the boron, ready to offer the calcium or the phosphorus, because they know that that's how they're going to get the best carbon, the best liquid sunshine. And so when a plant has all of those micronutrients and has that active teeming microbial community in its root zone, it goes from being a plant that is purely existing through photosynthesis, which is the case for a lot of plants that are just merely surviving. They're producing simple sugars. They're because they can create their own food by the sun and through carbon dioxide, they can still exist, right? But these are unhealthy plants. These are plants that don't have an active soil food web. And those simple sugars are the perfect foods for insect pests. And so here's another unlearning thing that we have to do. When you have plants that are getting attacked by insects or disease, we have to stop thinking about those things as evil or as things that are trying to hurt us or that are bad. Really, they are kind of bad, I'll admit, but we have to try to change our mindset about them to understand that they're giving us a clue. They're telling us that our plants aren't thriving; they're merely surviving. And those pests are kind of like nature's garbage people. Like they're picking up the garbage on the planet that is not really doing well, all those sick plants, and they're trying to recycle them back to make the system healthier overall. If they have plants that are just merely surviving on photosynthesis alone and doesn't have its full soil food web, the insect pests are going to consume it so that it can decompose, and that organic matter will feed the soil food web so that the next plant can have a better life. And this pyramid here is kind of a theory of trophobiosis, where the more nutrition and the more of an active soil food web that a plant has, the higher on the pyramid it can get to. So if you ever notice, like our plants that are grown in really poor soils, in monocultured fields or in industrial agriculture settings, you're not getting plants that can form the secondary metabolites. Like tomatoes are a great example of this. A lot of store-bought tomatoes from conventional massive monocultural tomato farms, they don't taste like anything. They taste like water. They've been bred for that in some ways because they need to be bred for storage and for shipping more than taste. But also the plants physically are not able to produce the secondary metabolite of taste and antioxidants, the things that create good human health, because they don't have the soil food web intact to give it the micronutrients it needs to get there. A famous quote from a Brazilian minister for agriculture is that a pest starves on a healthy plant. You can't feed pests when they have developed the lipids and they've developed complete proteins. They aren't attracted to those plants because they're not garbage. They're not needing to get cleaned up and recycled. So this is another, like I said, unlearning thing we have to do when we see those pests. Instead of seeing them as an affront to our garden, we have to see them as a clue and a part of nature that's telling us something, how we can improve and how we can help the soil improve. Here's just some cool pictures of all the organisms that I've been talking about. Here's a bacteria eating nematode on the left and a predatory nematode in the middle. It's got a really big mouth. Probably a lot of you are familiar with predatory nematodes because they can be purchased in quantity to help with pests like soft-shelled grubs that might eat your grass and stuff like that. These are my favorite, some beneficial fungi. These long strands are called hyphae. They go out into the soil and digest minerals. They digest wood and all different things. And then they take in the nutrients that are liberated from those minerals or wood, and they can carry them back to plants, or they can keep them inside their own cell walls to grow. And then when they get eaten by things like a fungi eating nematode, those nutrients that were stored in the fungal body is then available to plants. So just these amazing systems. This upper corner here is a rotifer. It's an aquatic organism that lives in soils. It eats algae and bacteria, and it's an animal. It is a multicellular microbial animal. Very cool to see in soil. Some other pictures. This picture on the left here I put because it's actually from compost tea that lost oxygen. So the healthy soil and healthy compost has a lot of oxygen in it, and it needs that because the soil food web and the organisms that have co-evolved with terrestrial plants need oxygen to thrive. In a compost tea, it's really important to keep the level of oxygen up so that you can grow the beneficial organisms that you want to apply to the soil. So in this case, the tea went anaerobic, it lost oxygen, and the beneficial fungus that we really wanted started to get consumed by anaerobic bacteria. That's what all these little lines that are kind of hoarding around the brown hyphae is. And this is kind of exactly what happens in soil. So what are ways that soil loses oxygen? The main way is when it's left bare. So let's imagine a big garden that just recently got tilled. A rain happens even a very light rain, the impact of every raindrop on that soil causes immense compaction. And when the soil starts to compact, especially if it has a lot of clay in it, it pushes out oxygen back into the atmosphere and it starts to compress. That any fungi, any larger like bacteria or predatory nematodes, some of the beneficial protozoa, they start to go dormant or they start to die because they can't exist, just like we couldn't if we got put on Mars where there's no oxygen. We couldn't exist in that ecosystem. But in a soil that's filled with air, those beneficial organisms thrive. So this picture is just a good one to keep in mind for a mental image when you see bare soil, because we don't want our fungi to be eaten by anaerobic bacteria. And then just a quick slide here on saprophytic and symbiotic fungi, because fungi kind of get a bad rap in the gardening horticultural world. It's actually a fact right now that this really scary fungal pathogen that's entering a lot of hospitals and really harming a lot of immunocompromised people because it's resistant to all fungicides. It's coming in on bulbs, like daffodils, tulips that are planted in the gardens around hospitals. And it's the fungus is a human pathogen when it gets into our bodies, but it's so scary because it's been in these bulb fields in Holland and wherever, where they've applied so many fungicides that the pest has learned how to be resistant. And so that fungus aside, the ones that are really scary and do cause disease, there are way more good guy fungi, beneficial fungi in the world than there are bad disease-causing organisms. Good guy fungi protect plants from disease. They actually can sometimes coat the roots of a plant and protect it from disease-causing organisms, including other fungi. They increase plant nutrition by providing phosphorus from the soil. Sometimes they can actually provide water and increase the hydration of the plant. They liberate and recycle nutrients by actually digesting rock and wood. Like I mentioned before, they produce really strong acids that can break down the mineral structure of soil and feed our plants all that is locked in those rocks and minerals. And fungi store carbon. So in all those hyphal strands, those little brown strings that I showed you, those are pure carbon. And so the more that we allow fungi to proliferate in our soils, the more carbon we're locking from the atmosphere, which is kind of a win-win because the soil is becoming healthier and that carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas, is getting taken out of the atmosphere, locked in the soil where it's really supposed to be. Through the action of their hyphae, those brown threads, fungi actually build soil structure. And this is kind of the point that I really want you to take home, is just how important the non-disturbance of soil is, because those delicate fungal hyphae easily get ripped up and shredded, but they're critical for maintaining soil structure. And soil structure is so key because that's how the oxygen is maintained in the soil. You get this positive feedback loop of organisms that need oxygen thriving in really well-structured soils, mainly due to fungi and other microbes that produce either the physical strands or that produce glues that kind of hold minerals into small aggregates that then kind of clump around. Here's just a cool picture of mycorrhizal fungi that is helping a pine seedling. So the only part of this that is plant are kind of the darker, thicker strands. There's like 3 of them, and the rest of this is all fungi. Without the fungi, if this was in a sterile potting medium or in a soil where the fungi had been either extinguished through some type of fumigation, or the soil had been tilled frequently and the fungi didn't get a good foothold, the plant would die. It doesn't have what it needs to survive because it doesn't have its fungal partner. This is a nice drawing that I did. It's kind of trying to show that the relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plants is a lot more complex than we even could ever really imagine. And it involves more partners than we previously thought. So in this example, here's a plant cell where a mycorrhizal hypha is entering inside of it. It's getting sugar from the plant, and the plant is telling the mycorrhizal fungi, I need some phosphorus. Go get me some phosphorus. And let's say this species of mycorrhizal fungi isn't the best at actually solubilizing phosphorus from the soil matrix. It will go then into the soil and it will start leaking out the sugars that the plant gave to it And it will do that because it knows in certain areas there's a lot of bacteria that are really good at solubilizing phosphorus. And so it feeds the bacteria colonies, and then they actually turn the phosphorus into a form that the plant can consume and that the fungi can carry. And so they'll give that to the fungi, it will carry it back through its hyphal thread into the plant cell, and that's a multi-organism exchange, still based on photosynthesis, but going way deep into the soil and involving so many other communities of organisms. It's just kind of mind-boggling. And so now kind of getting to this idea of what is healthy soil, talking about ecological succession. I just wanted to touch on this because I think it's something that in our gardening and farming practices, we have to really keep in mind. In really high disturbance systems, the soil, let's say tillage, let's say the soil every couple weeks or something, the soil is getting tilled, or at least, twice a season maybe, or in situations with a lot of fire, any sort of disturbance, those soils are going to favor bacterial growth. Bacteria produce nitrate, and when they die and their bodies kind of get decomposed in the soil, they're releasing nitrate, form of nitrogen. The best plants to handle a nitrate-rich soil are weeds. And so another kind of form of unlearning that we have to do is looking at weeds not as problematic or as these little the darn weeds taking over our garden, but as part of nature that are also giving us clues as to what's happening in the soil. Annual plants, that's my definition of weeds, by the way, is an annual plant that is putting a lot of energy into the proliferation of its seed. It's not putting down deep roots, maybe. It's not trying to exchange, it's not trying to grow a big soil food web community. It's trying to use all of its photosynthetic power to produce a ton of seed because its main purpose is to cover the bare soil. It doesn't want soil that is bare. It doesn't want soil that is unhealthy. And so the weeds are actually healers. They're like paramedics that are coming into these disturbed ecosystems. They're sucking up all the nitrate, which is also pretty toxic to a lot of things if it ran off into water bodies or our wells. They're trying to handle that. And so once a few seasons of weeds go by and they've started dying, decomposing into the soil, they're food for fungi, and we move from this bacterially dominant, weedy, high disturbance ecosystem into one where there's more fungi. So without disturbance, a bare soil will quickly, within a few seasons, turn into kind of a prairie situation with sod. That is a type of ecosystem where the balance of fungi and bacteria, like the amount of biomass of each, is going to be about equal. Without further disturbance, you can probably know this from your own yard if you forgot to mow, or if you have areas of the land that you reside on that doesn't get disturbed, it quickly becomes very shrubby, and you get like blackberry brambles and roses and wild grape, all these things that are perennial plants that are going to put a lot more energy down into the soil. They're going to leak out a lot more root exudates, a lot more cakes and cookies, because they're invested now. That soil has been stable for a while. It's starting to get more oxygen in it. It's starting to get more stability and more structure. Those plants are like, yeah, this is a good place to be. I'm going to invest here. And they're going to leak out the sugars to attract more fungi. Eventually, in old growth, very low disturbance ecosystems, the amount of fungi is thousands of times higher than bacteria. And they're forming a whole different type of nitrogen, which is ammonium. And so you'll notice too, like at pine trees growing along cornfields where there's a lot of nitrate fertilizer used, they're usually kind of yellowing and get a lot of disease. They don't always live very long. It's because nitrate is toxic to old growth trees or to conifers and some deciduous trees. And that's all because of how they've evolved to live with fungi in these low disturbance ecosystems. So just to kind of hit that point home one more time, and then I guess I'm running low on time, so I should hurry up here. Non-disturbance plus a lot of fungi plus all the microbial glues produced by fungi and bacteria, you start to get soil aggregation. That means pores, passageways, microhabitat, which creates this positive feedback loop for a living, breathing, oxygen-rich soil, fueling the growth of larger predatory organisms, more fungi, and really a situation where a lot of plants have co-evolved with those organisms to thrive in. By nurturing the soil microbiome that supports healthy plants, we become one of the symbiotic partners in this communal relationship that helps the garden bloom. So again, going back to that paradigm shift, now with this understanding of the soil, I think that there's very little, once you start to grasp those basic concepts of how the soil ecosystem works, I feel like there's very little that we really need to know or to do in terms of actually making practical application, I guess is where I'm going with this. I'm going to give you a few guiding principles, but with that knowledge and with trying to build this relationship with the soil, we have to also trust ourselves and know that we are part of the system and we have a lot to offer for it. So starting with the basics, like destroying the soil ecosystem, I think you probably all know what destroys the soil ecosystem. Excessive tillage, leaving the soil bare, using chemicals that are meant to kill things, using synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer is humans trying to take the place of ancient communal relationships between plants and microbes. We're not very good at it. We think, oh, NPK, we just have to supply these macronutrients. People are starting to get the hint about micronutrients, but even then we're applying them in massive doses once or twice per season, when in the soil it happens on a second by second basis at the plant's request. Monocropping, and then again, this idea of separateness and our scarcity mindset, thinking of ourselves as something other than nature, thinking there isn't enough to go around, thinking we need to hoard it because we're afraid of what nature might do or that we won't have enough. All of these things kind of keep us locked in this certain paradigm that prevents us from having a good, healthy relationship with the soil. Restoring the soil ecosystem, it's kind of the opposite of that, but also very intuitive things. Minimizing disturbance, planting diversity, keeping the sorry, I have this webinar thing in the way, but okay. Keeping the soil covered at all times, valuing organic matter and using high quality compost and microbial inoculants when possible, and then just respect and trusting the life forces of nature, including ourselves. That's kind of the main point I want to make here. We are part of these systems. We have also co-evolved with the soil ecosystem, and we rely on plants for our food. We rely on plants for our happiness. We rely on them for so many things. And so we really have to start seeing ourselves as caregivers and as mutual partners that have just as much to offer as we get from these plants and ecosystems in the soil. A few other just kind of big things that from my 10 years of working with soil health and trying to make as much healthy soil as I can, a few things that have really proven to be ways that we can more quickly, in nature is the ultimate healer. Any disturbance, whether it's all of the climate induced changes or the human induced changes that are happening in the climate, whether it's one field that's gotten tilled, whether it's a forest fire, whatever it is, nature will heal it over time. There is no question about that. Humans might not live long enough to see it because of our actions, but nature will heal it. Let's say though you want to do it a little bit quicker. You're a gardener and you know that your soil is not up to snuff and your plants are kind of getting by, but you have a lot of pests and a lot of disease. What can you actually do to help that situation? One of the main things that I really focus on is the Johnson Sioux bioreactor composting, and in my resource sheet I'll send the link to how to learn more about that. But essentially it's a static composting system that uses a lot of carbon, and from all the principles that I've already talked about, you probably can guess that a static carbon-rich system is going to fuel the proliferation of fungi. It's also a type of compost that doesn't get used for at least a year to 16 months from the time it's made. And so it's very oxygen rich. And by the time that you use it, it's had enough time for a lot of different organisms to grow and to expand their population. So you get this very microbially diverse inoculant to use on your soil. And so that really helps jumpstart the soil food web and to help get the plants the partners that they need. Vermicompost, I'm sure I'll get a question about worms because I always do. There's a lot of issues with worms happening right now, but I'll just say that vermicompost using red wigglers, the Eisenia fetida variety, is one of the best soil jump starters, one of the best soil healers that you can possibly make on your own. And so I think that is something that I will advocate as long as I can for. It is just they're a very peaceful worm species. They're not like the aggressive jumping worms that are becoming such a problem. The red wigglers kind of coexist with everything. They don't seem to take over in our soils up north here. And so I just love them, and I think that they show amazing results in the garden. Using living and dead mulches to keep the soil covered. Again, I can't hit this home enough that really the foundation of healthy soil, the only thing you really need to know to guide your way in building healthier soil is that the soil has to be covered. Ideally, it's with living mulches, because then you have all these roots pumping sugars, cakes, and cookies down into the soil ecosystem. But even dead mulches are providing food for fungi. They're at least reducing, it's like a sponge. When the rain hits it, it kind of has a shock absorbing capacity that prevents all the compaction down below. So that's super critical. And then again, the things that practically that we can do, polyculture, intercropping, continuous living covers. You know, gardens that are very biodiverse above ground are very biodiverse below ground. If you want to start healing the soil food web, start planting a lot of different varieties of crops in small spaces. A lot of traditional gardening wisdom kind of pushes us toward monocultural ideas, or towards this like competition model where you can't possibly put, you know, certain plants next to your tomatoes because they'll suck up all the nutrients. And that's really becoming outdated ways of thinking. There's so many beneficial interactions that plants share with each other. So you can always do some research on companion planting and how to make sure that everybody's getting what it needs. But largely, if you have a teeming soil food web, you're never going to have issues with nutrient scarcity in the soil. Every single soil contains all of the mineral nutrients that plants need. It's just the soil food web that's needed to actually break those down, churn it around, and be able to feed it to plants. And so the basis here, keep roots in the ground. That's the main principle. It seems too easy. I feel like people always walk away from this talk being like, you didn't tell me anything. What am I supposed to do? But it's so simple. There isn't like a capitalist thing that I can sell you to make the soil healthier. It's like the plants are doing it. They're photosynthesizing. They're baking the cakes and cookies and feeding it to soil microorganisms. Like, you're a part of that because you're giving the plants space to grow in your garden. You might be keeping the weedy species at bay and maybe replacing them with a dead mulch, like some straw or wood chips, to keep the ground covered, which is what the weeds were trying to do. You might be planting a lot of companion plants. You know, those are all great practical things, using good quality compost, but really let the plants do their job and let the soil heal itself, and then see yourself as part of that web of life that's benefiting and offering a lot to the system. Shifting our agriculture perspective, just to loop back around here, we did some unlearning, some relearning, and then a lot of new learning, hopefully. Step 2 of all this, once you've really got the principles, is using your own intuition, starting to trust yourself as a human being and somebody who has co-evolved with these ecosystems. Work on writing your relationship with the soil. Trust yourself as a shepherd, a caregiver, a healer. Go out there knowing that you're not alone, and that the soil is, you know, all bodies move towards healing, whether that be the human gut microbiome, ourselves, the soil body, the garden. It's all moving in that direction. And so I think that's really kind of where I'm at, is the step 2 of like learning how to become one with the garden and not feel separate from it and separate from those systems. And then step 3, communicating and spreading our understanding with compassion. We're like I said, we're stuck in this fear-based paradigm in the gardening, farming, agricultural, horticultural worlds. We're afraid of nature in a lot of ways. We're afraid of diseases. We're afraid of the things that nature can do. And so we perpetuate cycles of harm. And so I think that the more we can try to communicate this new paradigm, one that is based on love and trust and a shared relationship, I think the better off we'll all be. A quote here to end us off. The late great orchardist Michael Phillips said, "I'm fully aware that my main job as orchardist is simply not to screw up the life forces to be found in every healthy soil." And the founder, he's the founder, or kind of a major, keep going back, sorry. Masanobu Fukuoka says that the healing, well, the healing of the land and the purification of the human spirit is the same process, which is really kind of what I'm trying to get across here. So he says it very concisely. I say it very long-windedly and very quickly, but yes. Okay, I think we're on to the question phase. So I hope you all got something out of that, and I appreciate you listening to me jabber on for the last hour.
Okay, so first and foremost, I have to ask, who is this gorgeous creature?
Yes, right. This is a beautiful soil mite. Um, Again, mites and microarthropods are kind of creatures like fungi that get a bad rap, like they're going to be something that's eating our crops or doing bad. But this is just a beneficial little guy. He's doing his thing in the soil, probably shredding organic matter, making it more bioavailable to bacteria and fungi, and just looking cute as heck. So there's a lot of them like this. I'll include a link to a website that shows pictures of all these guys because they're pretty incredible.
The colors on, I guess, I don't know if it's a shell or not, but
Yeah, it's
the
just like
colors
an exoskeleton.
on exoskeleton, it's amazing.
Hmm.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, I'm getting a few questions that are pretty much asking the same thing, which is, what's your favorite ground cover? And what's your least favorite ground cover?
Okay,
Like, what
let's
is one that
see.
you would prefer to avoid?
Hmm, okay.
And what is one
So
you really like using?
great. Okay. I would say I am very still kind of stuck in the dead mulch phase of my soil health evolution. Um, I think that I've used a lot of clover. It's what a lot of people use, and it's awesome. But in the cases, I feel like it takes a lot more hands-on. If you have a lot of time in your garden, clover is amazing, because it is very strong and it is nitrogen fixing. It's a great crop, but it can also totally get out of hand. And so I have kind of mixed feelings about it. Um, I think I think using a lot of diverse ground covers, I know this is a controversial opinion, but in my perennial beds, I have a lot of hazelnuts, raspberries, and strawberries. The creeping Charlie gets out of hand. And I at first think, oh no, it's so weedy. Like, what are people going to think? Like this creeping Charlie is taking over. But then if you shift your mindset and look at it as an herb that is healthful, it's a mint, you can drink it in tea. It smells great. Like, why are we so mad at creeping Charlie? I think that in perennial areas, that one takes off. I think it must have a really good relationship with the fungi present in those beds. And so that's kind of, I guess it's not a great answer because I know people don't like to have weedy, maybe like invasive type plants as ground cover. But part of this paradigm shift that I'm working towards is also on our farm, at least, starting to embrace what is naturally growing in places. So the clovers, the creeping Charlies. I usually let some weedy things like burdock, I'll let them grow so that they shade the ground and keep it cool until they start to put up that weed seed spreading stalk. And so all those things, I let them grow until I'm afraid that they're going to go to seed, and then I just chop them down and leave them as a dead mulch. And so I use a lot of things like that. Whatever wants to grow and be a ground cover for me, I let it.
Okay. Um, is there anything that you try and avoid having?
Mm, not yet. I've worked with a lot of them, and I guess I have an annual, what do you call that when an annual becomes a perennial because it's self-seeding? I have a radish. I don't want to call it a problem because it kind of defeats the purpose of my whole talk, but I have daikon radish that I've used as a cover crop um, for many years. I've allowed them to go to seed because I'm too sentimental and I can never cut them down when I see their flowers and the bees all over them. And so that one, I now am like, before I ever use it in a fresh bed, I'm like, ooh, I don't think I'm gonna want that forever. And so, yeah, but other than that, I can't really think of any that I don't love to use. Sorry.
Okay, well, I'm gonna encourage anyone. Ah, somebody has, I didn't even get to ask the question. So anyone who has any more questions, send them in, please. Let's see. So Hannah has quite the problem. Says, I have a compacted, heavy clay that is low in nutrients. Every time I try to stick vegetables in the ground, they die.
Hmm.
I'd like to make a veggie bed. Would you go fully no dig, a la Charles Dowding, or bring soil in and make raised beds? I'm afraid I have to confess I am not familiar with Charles Dowding. I hope you are,
Um, yes,
and maybe
Charles
can
Dowding.
share with the rest of the class who missed that lecture. Haha.
Yeah,
In other
Charles
words, who?
Charles Dowden is great. He really is a proponent of sheet mulching to make new beds. I
Oh,
don't,
okay.
I've only seen a couple of his videos, so if anybody else is chiming in, feel free to cut me off. But I know in one, he was actually advocating putting down a thick cardboard, putting compost on top, and then in this one, it was actually he was trying to transplant carrots. So he had started carrot seeds in a pot, and I tried that this year, and it's working so far. And I plant in in those types of situations, I use the Johnson Sioux bioreactor compost, and I will pretty much plant straight into that. And it's kind of another controversial idea, like planting into 100% organic matter, 100% compost, and it works with mixed results for me. Like some batches are better than others, but yeah, I think in that we also on our farm have a very, very heavy clay. Like for our wedding, we asked for a pottery wheel because I wanted to try to make like pots out of our soil. Um, and it's amazing how dense and heavy it is. And even though it's been years, it's been in pasture where it hasn't been tilled or ripped up, it's still very compacted. And it's kind of the same as the person who asked the question. It's hard to just to plant vegetables into it. If I try to like dig out a row and plant into that, they fail every single time. And so I think in these situations, we really have to cultivate patience, unfortunately, because now in our third year here, I haven't done any tillage. I've done sheet mulching like Charles Dowding, starting with a cardboard layer, putting compost on top of that, or even just putting like fresh, we have goats, so I have all that raw material, like putting fresh goat material on top of the cardboard to keep it from blowing away. The first year and the second year, it was kind of like, this isn't looking so good. But the third year, oh no, I'm wrong because this is our third year. The first year there was nothing we could do with it. It was just like bad. Underneath the cardboard, the grass was still kind of alive. The soil was even more compacted because now it had like a heavy thing of like cardboard and goat bedding on top of it. And I was kind of questioning that method. Like, I don't think this is going to work. I don't know how to get this sod out of here. I don't know how to save this like clay soil. But now that soil, the cardboard is gone, the goat bedding is gone. It's teeming with worms. It's very, very structured now. Like the clay in the top couple inches at least has become very loose, and it has this really good tilth. Like it looks like healthy, very lovely, lovely soil. And so I think if you have some time and patience, go that method. But then again, you know, raised beds are always good too. Yeah, long-winded answer again, but I think if you have the time, it's best to try to grow in the ground, get the soil. Don't import soil from somewhere else to build a raised bed because you don't know where that's been. It's not going to improve the soil below it for the most part, and it probably isn't going to give you the most nutrient-dense, healthy plants that you're looking for either.
Okay. Sally would like to know if we should mix in the compost on a bed or just apply it to the top of the soil.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of things. There's a couple of things that come to mind with this. So the first being, if you have like a large scale garden or a farm where you have a lot of acreage, my like mentor in all of this is Dr. Elaine Ingham and David Johnson of the Johnson Sioux Bioreactor Compost, and both of those pillars of soil health and regenerative agriculture say that if you have a really poor soil, so this also kind of might apply to the last question, and if it's been tilled year after year, and there in the past has been a lot of like fertilizer salts applied, you're going to have a compaction layer that's actually like 6 to 12 inches down. And in those cases, you can kind of do as much as you want to the top, but you're always going to end up with kind of a poor quality soil because the water, when it rains, is going to like hit that compaction layer 6 to 12 inches down and then flood the top 6 inches. And it's always going to reduce the oxygen content of the soil that you can really get your hands on when you're putting in plants. And so in those types of cases, they do sometimes recommend like one more deep tillage event where you work in a high quality compost to kind of break up that compaction layer. So in that case, you want the compost to be worked in. But in a lot of other cases, in most cases, I would say, where the soil is like in decent shape and it's a vegetable garden maybe where you're going to be putting in transplants and stuff like that, use a really compost rich potting soil. And then every time you put in a plant, you're putting in compost and microorganisms. So you're getting that inoculant kind of naturally. And I'm assuming then you'd be putting that into like a living or a dead mulch. And so then you have the soil covered, you have a compost inoculant that you've worked in probably 5 or 6 inches. Yeah, and then on the last kind of side of that spectrum, if you just do a sprinkle of compost on top, if it's a really good quality compost, that can have a major effect. So if we're talking large acreages here, farming scale or like a lawn or something like that, if you have a good quality compost with a lot of life in it and you apply it at the right time, like before a nice gentle rain where it can kind of get worked down on its own, that's a great way to apply too. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. It kind of depends on your situation. I'll have to give people my email address, I think.
Okay, and we have time for one last question, which is if you don't suggest using the soilless mix for pots, what should we use?
So I think looking into Johnson Su bioreactor composting and using that, another thing about potting soil in general is that it's usually in the United States peat based, and peat is not a good thing to be using. Like, it's harvested from the northern regions. It's pure carbon that should be sitting in the soil. And so the mining of it is really harmful for indigenous communities up north. It's also bad for the environment, all these things. And so I really think that we can be making our own local potting mixes if we can start making these like very long term composts like the Johnson Su system where it sits for 12 to 16 months. That's what I've been using. And you can in our winter climate, you don't really want it to freeze, so you can make the pile, feed it to some worms. Like, I put it in our basement over the winter, and then in the spring it's ready to be used as a potting mix. We last year had to buy, I think, like 15 bags of potting soil because I didn't have the bioreactors going yet. And this year I bought one bag, so I reduced our peat load, by 14 bags, mixed that with like 7 bags of Johnson Su bioreactor compost. So the transplants that I'm working with now were grown like almost entirely in pure compost, and they're doing super good. And so I think there's like a lot of creative solutions that we can start working towards. Or, if that's not up your alley of making your own, or you can't, do that, there also are a lot of compost-based bioactive potting soils on the market. And so you just kind of have to look around for those and kind of know what you're looking for. You want something that does have a lot of compost and that is kind of made with those intentions to have activation of the soil food web.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maks, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar.